Let's now look at the other side. Let's look at the other side, by which I mean the employer. How did the last 30 years since the 1970s, how did it play out for them? Well, if the story of the working class I just gave you leaves you with an impression, and perhaps one that makes you slightly sad, let's go to the other side because you'll feel better. They've done better than ever before. Spectacular 30 years. And again, very simple to understand in economics. Over the last 30 years, what economists call productivity, the average amount of stuff that a worker produces in an hour of his or her labor for the employer then to sell, kept going up. The very computers I spoke to you about, better trained workers, more machinery, and workers having to work harder and faster. All of those things made what we as workers delivered to our employer go up for 30 years, year by year. Meanwhile, what the employer gave us stayed flat for 30 years. What we did for the employer goes up, and what the employer does for us doesn't. Hello? The gap between what we produced for the employer and what he pays us is called profits. They went crazy over the last 30 years. We've never seen anything like it. And of course, our stock market went nuts too, which is what happens since stocks are your claim on a portion of those profits. How did the employers of America, Main Street and Wall Street, how'd they deal with this? Well, it's really interesting. And again, partly it's interesting and partly I'm going to try to tap your sense of humor. The first thing the business community did was to notice that they were rolling in money. They weren't paying their workers anymore, didn't have to, but the workers kept producing more. This is called good news. And no sooner do you realize that things are going real well than you need to develop a theory, an explanation. And our business community didn't waste a minute, leapt right in. And here was their explanation. It is the case, they said, that the profits are going crazy in our companies because the top managers are entrepreneurial geniuses. And our culture became a culture that celebrates them. Lee Iacocca became a name people heard of. He was the head of Chrysler or Ford. Jack Welch, the lead executive at General Electric, and so on. They wrote books, or rather, they paid an out-of-work journalist to write a book as interesting as last week's oatmeal, but it was a bestseller. How I transformed GE from a little company making toasters into a global megacorp. All of this, and I'm now going to use a technical term in economics, all of this is bullshit. The reality of this is simply that they were getting more and more out of their workers and not paying them anymore. No mystery to the profits. This is about a social change that begins and ends with telling the working class, no more wage increase. You've had your good century, it's over. So instead we were given this story about the genius boss, but they had the last laugh because there's another reason to say it's entrepreneurial genius, because if the reason the company is making so much money is because the manager's a genius, then it makes sense to pay the manager accordingly. And the 1970s begins the zoom of American top corporate payoffs, salaries and bonuses that take off. From being roughly 40-1, the ratio of a corporate executive to an average worker, it's now 400-1. How nice. How useful. I do understand after the crisis hit a couple years ago and we all learned about how much money Goldman Sachs and the others are earning, we were as a nation outraged by the enormity of their payment packages. And I'm glad we're outraged. We're just 30 years late. This begins in the 1970s. What else did business do? Number two, they accelerated the movement of jobs out of the United States. Very important that you understand. When a corporation closes a factory in Oakland and moves it to China, it's risky, it's expensive, it's dangerous. The more money you have coming into your company, the easier it is to take that risk, to spend that money, and to go through all the upsets and adjustments of moving production. So it facilitated the very process that brought it about. It made more jobs leave. Third thing, you'll really like this one. The third thing American business did was to understand far better than the American left wing has, that in order to sustain a society that has been used for 100 years to raise the standard of living of its working class, to make it go through an adjustment where that's not going to happen anymore, you better be in charge and control of politics, or else that could spin in a dangerous direction. So over the last 30 years, our politics have changed, but perhaps not in the way you had thought. The mass of the working class withdrew from politics. I like to cite the work of a not Marxist sociologist at Harvard named Robert Putnam. Wrote a book with a funny title called Bowling Alone. Actually was a bestseller. And what he documents is the withdrawal of American working people from social engagements of any kind. Community organizations, labor unions, just withdrawal. Life was too difficult. The stresses at home were too great. The need to work so many hours was so overwhelming that social participation and also political participation was what had to give way. The machines atrophied, the political machines. The participation. And you know, if you don't participate, you don't pay much attention anymore either. The working class withdrew. At the same time, the business community, awash in money, moved in. They had the money. They could therefore play in the new game of politics, which isn't about organizing block by block, but is about TV ads. And the business community moved massively. It's not that the American people changed their politics from left to right. It's that the constituency of the left withdrew from politics. And the right moved in to fill the vacuum. But that wouldn't have been possible without this sea change in the root cause of our economic situation in the 1970s. Finally, the business community, awash in all this money, discovered something else. We are now so wealthy, these top corporate executives said, that we do not live in the same universe as other people. And one of the things we need specialists to manage the enormous sums of money that we're paying ourselves. We need a new kind of institution catering just to us. You all know what those are. Those are called hedge funds. And there began a tremendous new competition in the financial world in which stock brokers participated and banks participated and little independent hedge funds were set up everywhere, struggling to compete for the enormous sums in the hands of a relatively small number of individuals and companies that were sitting on mountains of wealth. And to compete, you had to make good returns, and to make good returns, you had to take lots of risks. They even invented new kinds of financial instruments, asset-backed securities, this new kind of a stock, which for those of you that might be interested, it isn't anymore buying a share of a company that makes something. That's the old idea, very old. The new, exciting, hot, sexy idea is you buy a stock that gives you a share of all the debts all kinds of folks have. So when they pay back the debts, you are the ultimate recipient because you've bought a share of what they owe. And so we have these new shares were invented in the 70s and 80s. You have a share of people's mortgages. So as the Smiths and the Browns in Alaska pay their $12.18 a month for their shack, you get 7 cents of it because you have a piece by owning that asset-backed security. And we first did that with mortgages, and then we did it with credit card loans, and then we did it with student loans and corporate loans and development loans, every kind of loan. And then we said, oh my goodness, the companies that were producing these new securities were making a fortune selling them to the hedge funds, which they had already created for the purpose of buying what they were selling. Very incestuous. Then they realized the whole world could be drawn into this. Here's a chance to have a really good investment. The American working class with its mortgages, richest working class in the world, what could be safer? And you're sitting there in China or Malaysia or Panama. Here, you invest in one of these securities. But the people there aren't quite so stupid, so they said, that might be risky. If any of you are marketing a security, it would be wise to get one of them to give you a rating, or to be more honest, to give you a good rating. So these companies determine how safe something is. So the way you sell it to somebody abroad, the way you do that is you get a high rating. You go to the company, you say, I'd like a rating. And they give you a rating. AAA is the best rating, and you try for that. And since, of course, you pay them, and that's how they earn their money, it's likely you're going to get the rating you want, because if you didn't, you'd go to the other rating company, which they all know. So all of the things that are now worthless got AAA ratings by one or all of those companies. It's a wonderful story of suckering in the whole world with these high ratings. But again, the rest of the world wasn't so stupid. It wasn't so stupid. It said, we know a little bit about those ratings. We know how shady these companies are. And by the way, shady is the nicest word I could give you. And in case some of you are wondering, probably the biggest one is Moody's. And I want to mention to you who owns Moody's, because the iconography of our business community is such that you really should know this. Warren Buffett owns Moody's. So the next time you hear that the Sage of Omaha, I kid you not, that's what he's called, the Sage of Omaha is a crook. Okay, it's a problem. His company made these assessments that anybody with half a brain would understand didn't correspond to the risks that were actually involved here, and there is all kinds of litigation going on now about all these kinds of ratings and so on. Okay.